Welcome everybody. Here we are, we're at the first seminar of Hillary Term 2026. My name's Tina Fawcett, I'm the convener of the Oxford Energy Network. This is my colleague Karen, who's the coordinator. And it's really nice to see so many of you here, particularly the master's students. So great that you've come to hear this talk. Before introducing our speaker, I'm just going to briefly say a couple of things about the network. If you haven't signed up to the network, please do. So if you go energy.ox.ac.uk, you can sign up to our weekly newsletters. Then you'll hear all about the talks that are happening, funding opportunities, talks across the university, all sorts of things that are going on. The second thing to mention is that next week's talk is by an academic visitor from the University of St. Gallen, and it's Moritz, not quite sure how to say his second name, I think it's Look, solar powered mobility at zero costs and zero emissions. So that's going to be in this room again, same time. Then if you look online, you'll see the whole programme of talks. And the third thing I wanted to mention is we're having an experiment this term. So we have got students who are going to be creating short form video from the talk, and also students who are going to be writing blogs based on the talk. So there's going to be more ways of accessing all of the seminars in sort of shorter chunks. If you haven't got time to watch the whole recording of those, you can't come to in person. So that's going to be quite a nice addition to the network, and it might be for the students here, it might be, I think we're booked up this term with people who've already offered to do that, but there might be some opportunities next term if that's something you're interested in. So we'll see how that goes, but we're quite excited about that as a new way of engaging people with the content of all the wonderful speakers that we have. Right, so now turning to today's speaker, we're delighted to have Rebecca Collier with us. So she is a contact of Jan Rosenau. Jan leads the energy programme in the Environmental Change Institute, and had the call to Davos to run a bunch of sort of energy panels there. So he's off being Professor Very Important over there, but unfortunately missing Rebecca's talk. But we're delighted that she's here. She's the Executive Director of Renew 2030, which is a global coalition which is looking to scale the use of wind and solar energy. She's also leads the international programme of the Pooled Fund on International Energy. And listening to her talk about her career, she's worked in a huge number of different organisations, including in the UK civil service, looking at building, scaling and mentoring the development of renewable energies across the world. And she's got stories to tell from sort of many different geographies across the world about this. She's also a TED speaker, which she was telling us about, an NPR speaker. And today she's going to be talking about philanthropy, policy and the power sector. And we're really looking forward to it. So over to you, Rebecca.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's a real honour. I studied here over 20 years ago, a lot over 20 years ago, and I've just walked past the beautiful honey-coloured buildings, which are a lot cleaner than they were when I studied here. They've all been tarted up, and it's giving me sort of a huge deja vu looking at you out in the audience, because I was in your shoes many, many years ago, and it's great to come full circle. So I'm going to talk today about your work applied to real policy change and what role philanthropy plays. And philanthropy is really distinct from government and business, from academia, from the world of think tanks. When I started out, it was insignificant, really, in Europe and on issues of climate. But it is now growing. And so we see ourselves as a important partner to you all, an asset, a friend, an ally, a source of funding, but also more than that, someone with whom to form strategies. And so I hope that through my speech and my talk this evening, I can give you shine a little bit of light on how philanthropy works, what we've done in a number of case studies, and look ahead a little bit at some of the challenges that I think are coming up. Thank you so much for introducing me. I did indeed start out in the UK government, in the Department of Trade and Industry, working on energy a very, very long time ago, before many of the policies that we now count as the bedrock of energy policy had even been invented. And it's hard to think back. There's no such thing as a contract for difference when I started out, or a flexibility market, or the consideration of looking at electricity grids as an alternative to static forms of fossil fuel pipelines. And this is a very different world that we're in. So hopefully I can talk a bit about some of those from-tos and how different actors play their parts, and hope that could be a bit of an inspiration to you all as you think about how your work might be applied as you go forward. When I was in government, I worked, as I said, on a legislative bill team. I worked in the European Commission in Peter Mandelson's cabinet on trade, and I also worked on infrastructure and planning reform. And then I went into philanthropy in 2008 when the European Climate Foundation was created. And the European Climate Foundation is Europe's leading pooled fund to change the conditions for climate and society in Europe. And I was one of the founding directors of the European Climate Foundation. So I've been in philanthropy since 2008, and I've always focused on energy and the electricity sector. So that's my career. But in the stories that you're going to hear, the role that philanthropy has played is going to become much clearer. Some of you may have seen an internet trend about going back to 2016. Not sure if it's everywhere. I'm going to take us back to 2006, because I think that sometimes we can feel quite disheartened about climate change and policy and our ability to have an impact. But when we go back 20 years and we look at an arc of change, I think it can really tell us about progress, both technological, in society, and in our fundamental understanding of how systems work together. And so I'm really hopeful that by jumping on the bandwagon of this internet trend, looking back to 2016 and taking it even further to 2006, I'll be able to tell some inspiring stories of how philanthropy has worked together with people like you all to influence the power sector. And I've put up two sort of illustrative examples of where I think we were in 2006. We were still at the phase very much of coming to grips with the implications of climate science for the energy sector. We had the IPC working groups. One of my founding mentors was the chair of Working Group 3 on the energy sector, Dr. Bernatz, who helped advise the European Climate Foundation when it was set up. But we hadn't yet thought fundamentally about how to translate climate risk deep into our energy policy and our infrastructure design. And we hadn't yet at that stage seen the phenomenal cost reductions in some of the key technologies that we see today. So we may have known as scientists at the cutting edge about the potential of renewable energy, but the world at large hadn't yet realized this tipping point that was illustrated in Science at the end of last year. It says we've now reached a global tipping point on renewable energy. And I think we might have called it a lot earlier than last year, but it's amazing to see how slowly society at large catches up with things that perhaps we've seen the green shoots of 20, 30, 40 years ago. They become more mainstream to the niche of people that know about them 20 years ago, and only now are people really calling renewable energy a scientific breakthrough. So I'm going to give 3 examples today, and the first one is a UK-based one. I'm going to talk about how philanthropy came around a planning decision for a power plant here in the UK called Kingsnorth. Then I'm going to talk about an era in European policy making that I call the road mapping era. And then finally, I'm going to talk about how that became a global phenomena, a combination of deep power sector decarbonisation and the rise of renewables. And what I hope I can also do, if this were not just a a journey from the UK to the European to the global, it's also take you on a little bit of a journey from how philanthropy started looking at things very much from a supply side point of view, stopping coal, frustrating the internal combustion engine, into a sectoral view, and much more these days now works from a whole energy system. I know some of you here today are from the MSc in energy, and it won't surprise any of you that people now have a whole energy system approach in philanthropy, and also that they have a whole of society, a global perspective. And that's been a real shift even since I started in philanthropy in 2008. So I hope that my stories can illustrate that. Together, I think these stories will show how targeted philanthropic action can shift narratives, accelerate markets, and set the stage for some of the next wave of changes, which is system-wide electrification, in my view. So, again, back in 2006, 2007, we had the beginning of the campaign for the UK Climate Change Act. We had the seeds of the EU emissions trading scheme when we think about policy. But we also had a planning application from a German utility, E.ON, for 2 new coal-fired units at an existing coal-fired power station in Kingsnorth. How to bridge the science with policy. How to make sure that one of the most advanced nations in the world that had been the birthplace of the revolution based on coal didn't make a catastrophic error. And a place where philanthropy is quite rich in the UK. I mean, philanthropy had funded work on eradicating child poverty, on ending the use of tobacco, on ending the use of slavery, but it hadn't turned its attention to climate as a topic. So what should philanthropy do as different from government and from business? Well, we realized that we had the unique ability to fund new policy research based on the science about what the impacts of those coal-fired power stations would be, and on the alternatives and pathways. The predominantly renewables pathways, the potential of offshore wind in the North Sea, etc., and bring them all together. So we funded a package of different work from think tanks such as Green Alliance, E3G, the Institute for Public Policy Research, academics all across the UK who were experts in this space, and also grassroots campaigners as well. Now, I don't know if those of you who have studied this space have ever seen photographs of a Greenpeace banner unfurling down the tower, existing tower at Kingsnorth. But one of your speakers later on in this series is Doug Parr, and I really invite you to ask him about that. Doug, if you're listening, that's a little prompt for your speech later on. But using those levers, philanthropy loves the word levers, of campaigning, analysis, evidence, we were able to put in place a fundamental shift that led to the cancellation of that project. Then what happened was a copycat series of similar campaigns across Germany and Poland. Poland had 96% of its power generation from coal in 2006, 96%. I think it's now down below 50. I need to check my numbers, but it's a fundamental shift in that 20-year period. Nobody thought it was possible to move Poland away. Nobody thought that you could stop a wave of new coal-fired power development around the world. And the current global pipeline of new coal-fired power stations is now absolutely minimal. And so philanthropy, we know that we're small, but we also sometimes feel that we're mighty. Then in the Bonn COP, I think COP 24, I have to get my COP numbers right, for those of us that work in COP numbers, the UK government and the Canadian government created the Powering Past Coal Alliance. And that was another philanthropy-backed initiative working with those governments to support other countries outside of Europe who also wanted to do the same. And they support governments working on policy with those stories of how the UK did its transition and helped put in place things like technical assistance packages, alternative power sector planning, and so on and so forth. Then this is the Glasgow COP, and this is the Energy Day. The Energy Day at the Glasgow COP was all about this topic. It was all about the central role of the power sector. And this is Laurence Tubiana, who's my boss at the European Climate Foundation, who's one of the architects of the Paris Agreement. And here she is launching a project also backed by philanthropy called the Coal Asset Transition Accelerator. And the Coal Asset Transition Accelerator takes existing coal plants, not new ones, that have a medium lifespan and replaces them with now much cheaper renewables with innovative finance mechanisms that allow both the financiers and the utility running that power station to have confidence in the new generation coming in from renewables. And we've got, from that project launched in Glasgow, in emerging markets like the Philippines, large conglomerates like the power company ACEN, ACEN, making the economically rational decision to take coal plants offline 10, 15, 20 years earlier than they otherwise would and replace them with renewable generation. And I always say regulate them out first, but you've got this sticky middle of coal plants that have got long-term PPAs, and it's actually very, very hard to persuade emerging markets that they should change their asset base in that respect. So this is a philanthropy-backed project that I also helped to set up that was launched in this arc of work that philanthropy has funded and taken on coal. And it's taken all kinds of interventions. Like I said, training, think tankery, deep academic research, and very significant positive partnerships with the renewable energy industry. But that's my first example. From Kings North to the replacement of a coal-fired asset in the Philippines. And that's just something that I want to touch on today. My second example is about Europe and the era of road mapping. So again, I have to take you back a little bit less far in history. It's not like Back to the Future, but to 2008. And the EU ETS was in place, 2020 targets were in place, but there was a concern amongst practitioners, a little bit as there had been with Kings North, like how do you bring that back to the power sector? This concept of road mapping, where you set a climate constraint out in 2050 and bring it back to the power sector of today, was very novel in 2008. All of you in this room are going to say, well, that's obvious. Of course, that's what you should do. But that was novel back then. It was a very, very novel way of thinking. And then looking at how you'd electrify the economy and what the necessary load would be on the electricity system and how you'd balance that and what the costs were and what the counterfactual gas build out in Europe was. That was not on people's radar in 2008, not on people's radar at all. So I worked then at the European Climate Foundation. I was the Power Programme Director, and I commissioned a piece of analysis that today you all would think was absolutely bog standard. But it was very innovative at the time. It was called Roadmap 2050. It looked at 3 different high penetration renewable scenarios. Scenario and an 80% scenario. It looked at the costs and it looked at the grid implications. We worked with DNV, who are one of the world's leading consultancies, but also with business, with think tanks and others. And that analysis came out about a year before the European Commission brought out their own Roadmap 2050 for Europe. It had very similar frame and it had a very similar conclusion. The lower cost, more affordable solution. It also concluded that market design that allowed for flexibility, that grid interconnection and finance were going to be some of the key barriers. Philanthropy then did follow-on studies on what the policy implications were going to be for Europe. And thank you. It concluded, that study, that harnessing the power of the wind in the North Sea and balancing it with solar everywhere, all at once, everything everywhere all at once is how I think about solar, was going to be a cornerstone of European energy policy. You have no idea at that point how much this study was derided. It was laughed out of town. The consultants that we worked with were then commissioned by the energy industry to do a formal rebuttal that said that our study was impossible. And yet, what came to pass? The development of offshore wind in the North Sea is a story you all know very, very well. Here you can see global levelized cost of electricity for offshore wind. And again, I'm doing a long time horizon, but all of that cost reduction here was in Europe. This is much more recently, it's global, but all of that cost reduction on offshore wind was because a series of visionary policymakers and business decided to put a bet on a high penetration renewables for Europe. And it came about because people made a very strong case that the counterfactual was worse in almost every possible way. And you just seen this, I just pulled this off DG Energy's website 2 days ago about the figures for solar growth in Europe. But I think one of the more powerful underlying stories here is what did solar do for Europe's energy resilience during the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and how much has it protected households in times of economic crisis. So I'm not saying there's a causality between what philanthropy did back with the Roadmap 2050 in 2008. You can see the arc. Every single analyst, every single person working in corporate affairs, every single person working in grids, every single person in an official ministry across Europe played a role in the energy transition over the last years. And now what we think of as the European Green Deal and European Industrial Strategy is fundamentally transformed because of this early stage of the road mapping era. And now on to my third example, which is much more global. And this is something that many different organizations played a part in. Ultimately, it required the signatures of 196 countries around the world to support a ×3 goal for renewables for 2030. And until that explicit goal was made, there was no single sort of exhortation from the COP process about what should be in NDCs in the power sector. It was pretty obvious, but it was not written down that renewables were a primary pathway to decarbonisation in the power sector, and that it required a fundamental shift, and it required driving further development on S-curves, especially in emerging markets. How did philanthropy play a part in that? And it was a small part. We always want to make sure that the credit goes to the people that are brave enough to stand up on the stage and sign up to the agreement. But a lot of work went on behind the scenes. And I've mentioned some of the institutions that we supported by philanthropy in the UK. One organisation that you might have heard of is called EMBA. EMBA didn't exist back in 2006. And to maintain their independence, they are philanthropy funded. And so that's where philanthropy funding is so useful, because it enables organizations to be free from business and free from too many ties to government, so they can be more critical. And in these days where our international institutions are buffeted by geopolitics, it's ever more important that these think tanks are independent. So well before the global ×3 renewables goal was an idea, Ember looked at where they thought a future pathway for global renewables should go by 2030. Philanthropy was also looking at doing articles in newspapers like the FT on where expected S-curve development could go for wind and solar to 2030 to make the economic case. And that was paving the way for a new coalition, advocacy coalition, to make the case for the ×3 renewables goal. And at that point, it was felt that the wind and solar industry were rather separate in their global advocacy for renewables. The industries worked on individual policies, but they didn't make a collective case for renewables as a primary pathway. And so in the run-up to the ×3 renewables goal, the industry groups clubbed together and created something called the Global Renewables Alliance, which is the umbrella industry association of the wind and solar associations around the world. And they said, you know what, we've got a lot to offer in terms of jobs, skills, growth, economic development, but we don't have a voice and we don't have a seat at the table as opposed to the traditional fossil fuel actors. And they came seeking funding for their efforts towards advocating for this ×3 renewables goal. And so a very deep industry partnership with the progressive parts of industry was born with philanthropy that helped to coalesce around the signature of that ×3 renewables goal. It's a target. It's a brilliant target. It's grounded in science. We will probably find that it's on the low side and it's inadequate, and that solar runs even faster than we thought. It is the way of targets. Once you've got it, then you think, so what? You know, that is necessarily what we often find when we're thinking about this in philanthropy. So in parallel to the international advocacy for the ×3 renewables goal, philanthropy helps to support a network of very deep policy expertise around the world. I work as an advisor to the Crux Alliance, which works on all sectors, and I'm on the board of the think tank Agora. But there's another very expert NGO working on regulators called RAP. There's an international network of international energy think tanks around the world that's in country, in local language, working on target setting, grids, market design, finance. And all of these are they fund themselves, but they're also funded by philanthropy. So we genuinely think that the implementation of the global ×3 renewables goal will be helped by some of these national level think tanks. And you know, I mentioned Ember as well. These did not exist. None of them existed back in 2006, and they are now really respected and credible groups in the energy space. And a final proof point that if you haven't heard about it, which I think everybody has, but a final proof point is around the Pakistan solar rush. It's a brilliant story. There's a NPR radio show about it, which I think is absolutely brilliant. So anyone who wants to know more about the Pakistan solar rush, they took advantage of the reductions in solar to set a zero tariff for solar panels for a period of time. They innovated in consumer-led finance for renewables, and they needed to do this because existing power supply was very fragile, and also because some of the long-term gas contracts had been diverted to Europe because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which put the Pakistani power system under great stress. So it was both a crisis and an opportunity, and Philanthropy was able to fund an NGO there called Renewables First that has been helping support some of the deep policy work there. So again, multiple actors, the perfect storm of technology, cost, unfortunately a crisis situation, but another case study that's a proof point on renewables. Finally, my sort of where does this go next? So that's when I look back over the last 20 years, I think we've been able to contribute in a constructive way to the development of the global power sector. This chart is from my own team, and it shows end-use electrification rates by different scenarios from the IEA and IRENA out to 2035. And there's a sort of convergence in the middle of the range at a 35% goal in 2035. And as campaigners and as philanthropists that like to land on something that's globally significant, I'm wondering when I'm looking out across the room tonight whether or not that might be something that we all come together in the international community as another norm-setting narrative frame for what needs to happen, not from purely a climate point of view, but also from an energy security, a cost, affordability and reliability point of view. So if I were to give you a hint about where I think philanthropy might be going next with its resources and its think tanks and its work, this may be an area that the science says is a fruitful place to go. Also, I think you've probably all seen this by now, I don't know. This is a newly published piece of work called the Electrification Ladder. It draws very strongly on our dear friend Michael Liebrecht's hydrogen ladder, but it's totally different. It's a piece of analysis. I'll make sure you can get the source because in doing a PDF, it's gone a little bit vague, but it's looking at the ladder of different potential cost implications for different forms of electrification. And I think this is going to be very important too in the sequencing of electrification. I'd say heat pumps they're there. There are low-hanging fruit, but industrial heat pumps aren't being taken up as much as one might expect. So much as we lent into solar in philanthropy, and so did business and investors and others, I would predict that this ladder should be the thing that we debate, that we argue over it, we pore over it. Everyone argued over the hydrogen ladder, and so we all should. So let's please argue next over the electrification ladder, but also let's then put our collective efforts into those that are the most affordable end of the wedge. So I wanted to give you that little hint. I think industrial gases as well. Someone on my team was telling me that industrial gases are ripe for a campaign on electrification. So that's a hint. And finally, I said at the beginning, where should you all think about engaging with philanthropy? Well, we are an asset and a friend. We are very different depending on whether we are in a pooled fund like myself that sets strategy for other philanthropies, whether there's individual foundations backed by a living billionaire or by a corporate foundation where the money's held in a trust, a so-called endowed foundation. But philanthropy is here to stay. It's both a patient and a nimble partner to governments, business and academics. And we see quite some challenges and opportunities ahead. We are, I think, as we all, dismayed by the degree of dis and misinformation in the energy sector and the space. And so if academia, science, but well communicated, and I see many of you in this room thinking about communications and novel forms of communication, if we can grapple that, that is something that philanthropy can assist with. Similarly, how do we make the case in emerging markets that the energy transition is unstoppable? How do we create stable and politically stable investment pathways in emerging markets? That's something very much on the minds of philanthropy. We think that workforce is a way that you get governments and people interested in the energy transition. And we think that linked to number one on misinformation, this sense of shrinking civil space is actually quite a challenge for the energy transition as a whole. And finally, I would like to make a pitch for a new organisation that's housed in my foundation, the Global Grids Catalyst. We've underinvested as philanthropy on the integration of renewables, on flexibility and the demand side. And so I was fortunate enough to announce at the end of last year a new global grids catalyst funded by philanthropy to the tune of up to 200 million to work on grids globally. And they partner with another organisation called Integrate to Zero that looks at demand side flexibility and virtual power plants. And so those are the areas that I think philanthropy is going to lean into. And I'm just exactly on time. And I want to say thank you for this whistle-stop tour from 2006 to 2026 and for having me here today. So thank you very much indeed.